Christopher Skase, young, handsome entrepreneur. He finds epic success in the 80s.
He came with that cowboy energy. He was doing big things.
Skase becomes a media mogul.
He outbid the legendary Rupert Murdoch.
His empire teeters, but he outfoxes them all. I'm Mark Humphreys. Search for ABC Rewind and look for Skase, Fall of a Tycoon on the ABC Listen app or wherever you get your podcasts.
ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
Bryce Courtenay was one of Australia's most successful writers. His first novel, The Power of One, was a worldwide bestseller and made into a Hollywood film. Bryce went on to write many more books. They'd usually come out each November in time for Christmas. Bryce said of his novels, they promise 35 hours of entertainment. That's what my readers are buying. Before reinventing himself as an author, Bryce was the quintessential adman, brilliant at selling a vision of brio and optimism. Advertising honed Bryce's natural skills in winning people over to his way of seeing things. And growing up, Bryce's second son, Adam, was in his thrall, delighted by his dad's storytelling gifts and unbridled confidence. But as Adam grew into a man himself, he became more attuned to the gaps between the stories that Bryce told about his family and himself and the facts. He became more and more curious about what was driving Bryce's need to be adored by all those strangers who loved his stories so much. Adam's memoir is called My Father Bryce. Hi, Adam.
Hi, how are you?
When you were a kid in the late 60s and early 70s, what opinion did you have of your dad's job in advertising?
Oh, look, I just thought he was sort of a magician. I think he seemed to know everything. When you're a kid of 6, 7 years old, you're thinking, what's the next best thing that's going to happen? And that could be, when's colour TV coming in, or when can you buy a walkie-talkie, or the new train set? And he seemed to know about these things because he was in the advertising industry, which knew all the great new things that were coming out, because that's what advertising people did. So I saw him then, even back then, as a sort of the sage of all things. He knows what's going. He knows what's happening.
And when you'd visit your dad in his office, how did Adland strike you? What kind of environment was it?
Even from an early age, I remember going there in the late 60s, early 70s, and it was always a sense of bonhomie. Everybody's laughing and slapping each other on the back, and it's a very colourful place too. There's colour, there's big pictures, and of course in the late 60s it was all psychedelic. There were colours everywhere. There were people dressed in jeans. There were people with long hair. Everybody looked cool. Where my dad worked didn't look like where other people's dad worked, where they all had short haircuts and wore suits and ties. These guys were crazy kind of people. And I thought, my dad's he's with the in crowd or something like that. That's what I thought.
What were some of Bryce's best-known ad campaigns? Well,
the best known by a long shot, of course, is Louie the Fly. Whether he actually invented it is a little bit of nobody's quite sure about that. But Bryce actually created the very famous ad with the fly walking across the screen. And funnily enough, I don't know if people know this, that he walked across my elder brother, who would have been about 1. So that my brother had his first starring role at the age of 1 in 1961 or 2 or something like that. Anyway.
And how highly did he rate his own skills as an ad man?
Oh, he was the top of he believed himself to be the top man at his job. Him and John Singleton were kind of the enfant terrible of advertising. And Bryce would constantly say, I am the greatest copywriter in Australia, by the way, just to remind us whenever
just
possible.
At home?
At home, to people, to everyone. He wasn't lacking in self-optimism, if that's the right way of putting it. And Singo was sort of the crass one. He was the intelligent, sort of slightly intellectual kind of... And, of course, he used to talk about people like Philip Adams, too. They were pretty good as well, but Bryce was tops.
He'd built this big career in Australia. How did your dad feel about his adopted homeland?
He believed Australia was the greatest country. He just said it. Australia's the greatest country in the world. He came out of South Africa. He used to talk a lot about the apartheid regime. He hated it.
What did he love about Australia?
It's just freedom and the way people laughed at each other. He didn't believe the South Africans had a sense of humour the way that Australians did. Australians laughed at themselves. South Africans didn't. He may have had a big ego, but he never believed in white supremacy.
When you were growing up, Adam, what did your dad tell you about the origin of the family name, Courtenay?
Oh, look, it was something related to... he told me we were related to Robin Hood. I don't know how he knew that one, because Robin Hood doesn't exist. And then he told me that there was some famous, I think it was Robert de Courtenay, that was a famous crusader who was the king of Jerusalem at some point. So I was to believe that we came from some famous Norman family, because the name Courtenay is actually of Norman origin. He later, I don't know how he grafted this in, but one time he came out with this coat of arms when I was about 12 and said, look, this is the Courtenay coat of arms. And it was something related to the Duke of Cornwall or whatever it was, one of the dukes in. So I believed everything.
So beyond these aristocratic antecedents of the Courtenays, how much detail did he share about his own childhood?
Oh, look, it was in bits and pieces. You'd hear, it was clearly, one thing it was for sure, it was clearly a deprived childhood. The thing that I always felt was really interesting, even sort of feeling it then as a young kid, I was thinking, what was little dad like? And little dad seemed to be always alone. There was no friends. He never talked about my friends and my mates and we do this and that. He'd talk about things like I'd rummage through garbage piles and try and invent things and make things from... He made a bike or he made a billy cart from a pram or something. He would scavenge things and he would make fun for himself because there was no one else around.
So what about his mum and dad? What did he tell you about his parents?
Well, his dad had died in a car accident. He was a famous lawyer or something along the lines, an anti-apartheid lawyer, and died a few months before Bryce was born. So I just believed it. Well, why wouldn't I? He had a car accident of some sort, and that's all I knew. And mother, he would talk about, I did know that she was extremely religious. I did get the sense over the years that he wasn't, and that he had rejected that side of her.
And when he spoke about South Africa, how did he paint it as a place?
He painted it as this sort of dark place where magic happens. And it was also always related to voodoo or some ghost or something like that. And these stories were brilliant. I think they're brilliant even now.
As a young man, Bryce spent a few years working in the copper mines of what was then Northern Rhodesia. Did he talk much about that experience?
He did. That was one of the things he did talk a lot about. One of the things I never felt he was lying about was when he talked about the copper mines. It was so brilliantly put and so clear that this is absolutely the truth. And it is absolutely the truth. And what he experienced, I think it formed him into a man.
What were the conditions like?
The conditions were terrible. I mean, just terrible. There were no safety issues practically, except use your own wits not to do something stupid. And so he was an explosives expert. So, in other words, the safety thing they said was, make sure when you explode, you're far away from that's how good the safety was in these places. And he said the terrible things could happen to you there. He talked about having to go into the showers with a knife. He talked about people torturing each other just for fun. And that's all part of that mystical bad South Africa, or that part of the world, I should say, that he inculcated in me. So I was very scared of Africa, really. So
thinking, Adam, across this kind of range of stories, from the connection to Robin Hood to this incredibly brutal experience in the copper mines, these stories that your dad would tell you when you were a kid, what do they have in common? Yeah,
Bryce the hero. It's everywhere. It's everywhere from whatever situation he was in. Bryce at the centre of all things, fixing things, making things right. Whatever bad happened, Bryce would be there to save the day. And that, of course, I believed it all. I'm 8 years old, and I think, God, my dad not only knows everything about what's happening, he's a hero too. I'm in awe of him.
At home there was you, your older brother Brett, and your younger brother Damon. What was different about Damon?
Well, of course, there was the fact that he was haemophiliac. He would bleed internally, constantly. It meant that you had to be very, very careful with him. One misstep. My elder brother and I would punch each other up all the time. Damon, you had to treat very, very carefully. But I think we realised quite early that he couldn't be part of that, and that if he was going to be strong, it would have to be strong in his mind.
Because of his haemophilia, Damon would have these awful, uncontrollable bleeds and would need to go into hospital to be injected with a clotting agent. What were those nights like when he was having to wait to go into hospital when it opened in the morning?
I'd hear him crying, and for some reason he'd be put into the lounge room and he'd just be crying all night, and no one, it couldn't do anything about it. And I couldn't sleep because I was hearing my little brother. So I wasn't a storyteller myself, but I knew great stories. By then I was 8 or 9. I was reading quite a lot. So I think the Chronicles of Narnia and The Hobbit and things like that I'd read, I just started telling him. And the miraculous effect of reading to a person in pain, to Damon anyway, was that it just stopped it diverted his mind. So it was almost like I could stop him crying for 2 or 3 hours. By then it's 5 a.m. in the morning and I'm half asleep. And I remember thinking, oh, okay, maybe he can sleep. I'd go back to bed and I'd hear him crying again. It's like the reading had this miraculous effect of at least changing his mind from one thing to the other. And then by 6 a.m. my mother and father would be up and they'd take him to the hospital to get the precipitate. And that rigmarole would happen. Sometimes it wouldn't happen for a week, then it happened 3 times a week. We don't know how he got his bleeds, but he was extremely susceptible to getting them.
How involved was your dad, was Bryce, in Damon's care?
Heaps. Bryce was always with him. He was the one who took him to hospital. He often stayed up nights, probably when I wasn't there, and talked to him and probably did the same thing, diverted him as much as possible. That was their time, I think, early in the morning. And I think they got to know each other in a way that I never did with my father.
A child being ill, so ill, would be a huge stress and a source of distress in any family. How did that play out in terms of the dynamics that you were aware of between your mum and dad? What kind of love story was theirs? What did you observe about their relationship?
If you're talking about the personalities, Bryce was a fixer of everything. My mother was not, I hope this doesn't sound sexist, but she wasn't a home type. She was a very, very cultured lady, cultivated lady. She didn't want to do the domestic stuff. And Bryce, on the weekends when he was mostly home, would just take it over. He'd do the cooking. I never saw my mother iron a shirt, for instance. It just wasn't built that way. And I've seen him. He taught me how to iron. He taught me how to clean my shoes. He did all those little things that, in those days, women supposedly were meant to do. And so the dynamic was Bryce, the doer. B was the kind of the cultural artistic spokesman for the family, if you like, and it worked very well in many ways. They were chalk and cheese, but they worked off each other very well in some ways. Was
your mum aware that your dad saw other women alongside
absolutely.
That marriage?
I believe so. I'd hear her shouting and screaming. Who is he with now? And she pretty much knew who he was with. I don't want to put it any out. Bryce was a philanderer from way back. And it's not just me saying what I knew. It's people coming to me afterwards, even now, saying things about him. It tore my mother apart, and it tore me apart because my mother, I saw how incredibly much it hurt her. And being in the room with my mother being hurt was you just didn't want to be there. You just didn't want to be there.
A lot of drinking went on at Australian dinner parties, Australian social life in the 70s. I imagine the advertising world really supercharged all of that. What sort of man was your dad when he'd had too much to drink?
Not a very obnoxious person. All the gentility, and he had kindness. When he was his normal Bryce, he was the kindest, most gentle, wonderful dad, and attentive. Put the demon drink into him, and he started to show his insecurities. He started believing his family was almost paranoid. He was against him. We were working against him. And he would start saying that none of us were ever good enough, that we weren't worthy of him, that everything was our fault, and what the hell is wrong with all of you, blaming us for everything. Next day he was repentant and sorry, and he'd be back to normal. So I think, okay, let's just wipe that one off. But, these things do have a way of staying in the system in a way.
How did doing a handstand end up transforming the way that your dad lived his life?
Yeah, well, around about the age of, I was about 12. He would have been in his early 40s, I think. Bryce was still was always a naturally good athlete, and you could pass a ball brilliantly, play a cricket guy, footy guy. That's just, he was South African. They were born for these things. So there was nothing Bryce felt he couldn't do. So me and a mate, we were trying to do handstands, and because that was a cool thing to do on skateboards in those days. And Bryce said, well, yeah, it's easy. Next thing you know, he's doing a handstand.
Not on a skateboard.
Not on a skateboard. No. Sorry, He's just doing it on the outside on the grass. And then we skated away and looked back, and he's still doing a handstand like 30, 40 seconds later. I don't think he even realised this himself. The next day he had a terrible trouble with his back. To me, it's fairly obvious that doing a handstand in your 40s, when you probably hadn't done one for 20 years or whatever, is going to cause a little bit of trouble.
That kind of led to a new health obsession for Bryce after that. What did he take up sports-wise after he recovered from that back injury?
He had a very bad back operation, and that kept him still for 4 to 6 months. And then I think he went for a little run with a mate and realised he was incredibly unfit, and something sparked. He just said, I've got to get fit, and I'm going to change my life. If I keep going this way, I'm in trouble. Then he became a runner, and then running was just everything. It just became an obsession. And then his natural abilities, because he was a very, very good athlete, and he was small, he was wiry, he was very quick, and he realised after a few months of doing this, he could be very, very good at this. And Bryce, of course, for whatever he did, had to be the best at everything. And he became, and I went running with him, and I was like 17, 18 at the time. I thought I was fit, but I was still smoking a bit in those days, because most kids did. Well, not most, but anyway, I did. And we went around and did a 5-kilometre course, which is not very big. And I thought, there's my dad, nothing. It's my dad, he's 30 years older than me or something. He absolutely killed me. And I think he enjoyed it too. Put me in my place.
It wasn't only running he was passionate about, but also fruit. Tell me about Bryce's feelings on fruit, Adam.
Look, I've always tried to work this one out, but I call him the phantom fruitologist because he got this obsession around about the same time he was running. I don't know if it was related to the fact when he was a young person in South Africa, they didn't have any fruit. So suddenly he comes to this bounteous country called Australia, and in Sydney there's fruit everywhere. And he was part of Sydney Striders, and they would have this big run on a Sunday, and he'd bring loads of fruit to them. And I remember seeing watermelons everywhere and pineapples and stuff. And then, because he had this overload of fruit, because not everybody was going to eat it, he just decided, I wonder if John Smith down the road would like it. So suddenly people were getting fruit deliveries, our friends. So the next thing they know, these people would, there's a box of fruit on my front door. This is very Bryce. This is very what he was about. Very much, I want to give things. He loved giving to people. And that's a great part I want to stress about my father. He was a natural giver, not a taker, a giver. And he would travel all over Sydney, dropping off boxes of fruit to people. And it doesn't matter whether you lived in the north, south, east and west, you would get a Bryce. And so he was a phantom fruitologist, and people didn't, after a while they realised who was doing it, but they didn't always know. They just got it.
You got a bit of an insight into your dad's psyche when, as a teenager, Adam, you snuck in, while still underage, with your older brother and his friends to see the horror movie The Exorcist.
Yeah.
First of all, what happened to you after that, or what did that film set off in you?
Look, I can never quite understand the psychological reasons. Something about it. In those days, to see a film like The Exorcist, I think probably these days it's probably, the kids would probably laugh at it. But there were things going on in that movie that no one, I don't think, had happened before. People were running out of the cinema. It wasn't just me. People were running out of cinema. I was with a whole bunch of friends, but all of us we were ripping our seats, saying, I can't, oh no, it's going to happen again, or something like that.
Terror.
It was
terrified.
terror. This was late 70s. So we snuck in. I was 15. I shouldn't have watched it. I think I was very down on myself at the time, and I just felt very strange. I came to believe, this film just seemed to come back into my mind. And I came to believe it or not, that I was possessed. And I knew it was stupid. I mean, of course I knew it was stupid. I just felt that I wasn't quite myself, that there was something else in me. And it became an obsession. I couldn't get this thing in the back of my mind away. So I went to see my parents about it. And Bryce was probably the most helpful of all people to get me out of this stupid fixation.
What did he say to you?
He said, it's not unknown to have a fixation like this. It's not anything to do with possessed. It's something in the back of your mind that says you believe you've failed and you're a failure, Adam. And I've always been glass half empty kind of guy. And it's the manifestation of that, he said. that until you believe in yourself, in a sense, you will always have this problem. So I said, okay, well, what do I do? He said, every time you think about this thing, just laugh at it. And so I did, and I laughed at it.
Kind of cognitive behavioural therapy.
Well, it is. Where did he learn this? This is the other thing. I don't know where he learnt this stuff or got it from. This is another thing about my dad that I never understood. He just seemed to have a natural understanding of psychology.
And it was helpful for you,
it was helpful.
Direction.
And within a few months, I wasn't thinking about it anymore. It took a while because I had to work on it. I didn't see a psychologist or a child psychologist. Within a year, it had gone. The other thing was he seemed to understand what a kid could have a fixation or an obsession or something stupid like that, as if he knew it and he knew how it's learned to conquer it himself. And that goes a little bit back to when I said he did all things by himself. He had to work things out for himself. He had no mentors. And that's where his power comes from, I think.
How did you first learn that your father was writing a novel, Adam?
I was living with them in a little flat we had in an area called Rose Bay in the eastern suburbs. And suddenly I was in the adjoining bedroom, and he had a little study, and we had this word processor. I think it was 86. And suddenly this thing would be whirring, and in those days, word processors made big noises, buzzing, and if you deleted something, you go buzz, or something like that. A terrible machine. So it was buzzing and clicking and whirring, and I couldn't really sleep very well, but it was going on till late at night, 11:30, 12 o'clock at night. And in a few days, he said, I've got something I want you to read, you and Mum. It's called The Tadpole Angel. And I just knew Bryce had been talking for 20-something, 30, ever since I'd known him, that he had a book in him. And I just cottoned on. I said, that's it. That's the one he's been meaning to do. It wasn't called The Power of One then. It was called The Tadpole Angel. And it was beginning to multiply every day. It would double and treble.
Were you reading it?
Oh, I was reading
Adam?
everything. I had to read it. I wasn't given a choice, really.
How did it strike you? What did you think of it?
It was fantastic. I mean, I just absolutely knew it was fantastic. From the first chapter onwards, and Mum was saying the same thing, I'd read some of his documentaries, and I knew he was a great writer, and it always helped me write. But this was something else. This was like, I can't explain it to you. I just was reading it and go, what's going to happen next? I was gripped, absolutely gripped, and it was just so beautifully written, so brilliantly written, and the pathos kept coming and coming. I'd go, oh wow, and I knew this was the big one that he'd been putting around in his head for years, and he'd talked to me about it before, and he told me little excerpts of things, and he said, I've got to, he'd just say things, and then the next thing you know, it's in the book. Wait a sec, he told me about that in 10 years before, and there's all this stuff so I think he'd been beta testing me for years. So I wonder what Adam thinks of this little story. Then he realises I liked it, so he's added it in.
And once it got to being written down, did he want your feedback of it in that form?
No, feedback. What's not real feedback. He just wanted to be told it's brilliant. Bryce was, for want of another word, he was extremely thin-skinned. He wanted 100% pass marks. It's like a student handing in their essay, and he wants an A every time. Not, here's the criticism and you can do better. Just tell me that it's great. Just tell me it's great. And it wasn't just us. Once it started building and multiplying and becoming this, the manuscript got to as big as the bottom of the average desk. There was about 8 or 10 folders of writing, and it was huge. And he just wanted to be told how good it was. And so I then cottoned on, don't knock it, just let him go and tell him that it's great, because that's what he wanted to hear.
Where did the final title, The Power of One, come from?
That's an interesting story, because around about that time, mid to late 80s, he was very involved in a thing called the Silver Method, which I think still exists. And someone had written about the Silver Method. Now, it's the power of positive thinking, what it is. So Bryce used to say, if anything goes wrong, and my mother hated it. She said, I'll just silver that. Oh, we need a parking space. I'll silver that. And what he meant was, I can use my power of my mind to make things happen.
Things like a parking spot.
Yeah, like a parking spot. I'll just silver it. Later, there was another thing, positive thing. Oh, I can make things happen.
Like manifestation.
Manifestation. If you could manifest things. And if you believe positively enough in something, it will happen, which is a nice thing to have. It makes you always confident that things will happen.
Sounds like what an advertising man might believe.
An advertising man full of himself, yeah, he believed that. But the Silver Method was and then he became kind of mixed in with his running. You can make things happen. So he was marathon running by this time. By the mid to late 80s, he was a very, very good runner and doing marathons. And he also believed that pain was part of the power. So the more pain you experience, the stronger you will become.
The power of one was a catchphrase.
It was a catchphrase used by the Silver Method. By this time, the manuscript, giant as it was, had got to Jill Hickson, the wife of Neville Wran, and she was one of the best-known literary agents in the country. And she said, "We can't have the tadpole angel. No one knows what the tadpole angel. What does it mean?" And it's something to do with some African tribe and some totem or something. I don't know. And so Bryce said, "Oh, I know what I'm going to call it." I was there when he said it. "I'm calling it the power of one." And Jill thought that was excellent. We all said, well, why not? It sounds pretty positive. It's good. It became the power of one.
How quickly was the power of one successful?
Oh, extremely successful from the get-go. Of course, there was a very big lead up to it. There'd been big articles in the press. The most important one came out in the Australian. Bryce Courtenay paid $1.3 million for his first novel type thing, and that went out in the Australian front page, of course.
And he would have been delighted by all that.
He was. So people were expecting it. Everybody knew it was coming. It was like a film. One of the great films. You go, oh, I can't wait for that to come. And of course, not only people who liked that sort of literature knew it was coming, people who didn't like that literature. So there were people ready and willing to read it and say, what's this great adventure story? And there were people, I believe, ready and willing to rip it apart.
With the success of that book, were you proud of him, Adam?
Oh, unbelievably. Here's my dad. I was always proud of the guy who wrote Louie the Fly, and I was proud of the fact that he was a great writer. He was writing for the press. My dad was prominent. He was writing a column. He was well known in advertising. Suddenly comes up with the biggest book an Australian had written, and in many, many years, I think probably since the Thornbirds, Colin McCulloch's, and I'm sitting there going, wow, how has he done this? And I'm there in disbelief, but I'm drinking the Kool-Aid at this point.
Readers assumed that Bryce had based PK, the hero of the power of one, on himself, on his own story. Did he encourage that identification? Not only encourage it, he made people believe it. It wasn't just trying to cajole people. It got to the point where you wouldn't know who PK was and who Bryce was. And I think he did it very, very smartly and cunningly. He made so much of what PK went through was similar to what he'd been through, and the places were all exactly like they are and still were. And of course, remember in 1989, apartheid was still there, so it was still a very large topic in the world. So it was beautifully placed, if you like, publicity-wise or whatever you want to call it. I believe PK was his avatar, the man that he wanted to be. You describe sometimes hearing him tell stories of PK's adventures as though they were his own stories, the scholarship to Oxford or the flight from South Africa. Do you think he was aware that, this is who he'd written about, or did he think that had happened to him? I believe he knew that it was what he was sending out to the world was BS, but he didn't mind. Bryce, he believed the truth is what you want to tell people. The truth wasn't important to him. What you conveyed to people and the stories that you put into people's minds and the happiness you give them is much more important than whether it actually happened or not. I always felt there's this ambiguity. Storytelling has this difficult ambiguity because you say, tell me your story and I want to know the truth. If I ask Sarah Kanowski's story, you'll tell me how you grew up, etc., etc. Then they say, tell me a story. The difference has changed immediately. Bryce didn't know that distinction. If I said to Bryce, tell me your story, he won't make that distinction. He'll tell the story he'd like to tell. And so there's always this ambiguity with stories. Fantasy that we want to hear at some point, something that makes us feel good, which is and something that's absolutely true that may not make us feel good. And he decided there's no distinction there. Make them feel good at whatever I say. You've described how your younger brother Damon suffered from haemophilia. And when he was still just a teenager, it was discovered that he had contracted HIV and hepatitis from a blood transfusion. And by the late 1980s, his health was in a terrible state. HIV had developed into full-blown AIDS. He was suffering infection after infection. You were living in London by that stage and got the call to come home in 1991, just before Damon passed away. You know, given how much your brother had suffered from the haemophilia and then the HIV, the AIDS, the hepatitis, all of that, was there a kind of relief in him getting free from that and passing away?
For me, it was. I think for my parents, no. I just hated seeing. I mean, he was just an awful relic of the person that he once was. Even as a young boy, as a haemophiliac, yes, he'd have some. His joints were swollen and things, but it never changed him as a human. This thing absolutely, AIDS, as we've all seen and know, just totally changed him and made him to this skeleton of a person. But he was still there, even right to the very, very end. He was still there as a. I could still feel Damon there, and that was a real power of one. That was Damon's power of one. That he could, in 8 years of suffering with this terrible introduced disease, he was still himself to some degree.
Was he conscious still when you made it back from London?
Yes, he was. I was there, and I think he was alive for another 3 days. And, you know, there was a situation where I just broke down and I said, why did it have to happen to you? I just wanted to go back to when we were kids. I mean, I really wanted to reverse the clock. And he put his shoulder on me and said, nothing we can do. And I bawled my eyes out, to be honest. And there was him looking after me again, you know, telling me it's okay. You've got your life to go on with. And it was, his power, that's his power. He made me feel better when he was even at that sort of a state of just being close to dying.
What had you seen your dad doing at Damon's bedside just after your brother passed away?
He was singing a Zulu song, and here's a very, very strange thing that I haven't really said. I didn't say it in the book either. I can understand it, and I don't know why. He was singing a song in Zulu, and it was all about, you are now going up to the heavens and you can be a warrior. And you are a warrior and you can now fight and hunt the rhino and hunt the tiger. And I was listening in for 15 or 20 seconds, and I thought, oh, what am I doing here? This is their time. And I absented the room. But there were some very strange things about Bryce.
You understood the
I understood what he was saying.
In Zulu.
I just knew what he was saying. I didn't understand the words themselves. I knew what he was chanting. I don't know how. This may sound a bit strange and it's into the twilight zone, but there was some very, very interesting things about Bryce that I can still not understand, and he made me understand what was going on. He didn't even know I was there, by the way. He was chanting, and I was just in the background. I opened the door, and they weren't looking at me, and I was just, what's going on here? That's something I'll never understand.
What did Bryce tell you quite shortly after Damon's death about the book that he was going to write?
Literally within days of Damon dying, he said, I'm going to write the book about Damon. And Damon's asked me to do that. Now, I never really believed him. I thought Bryce just felt he had to do it, and now he's giving himself an excuse by saying Damon asked me to do it. His girlfriend at the time, Celeste, says, yes, it's true. So if she said it's true, then Damon did ask. So I have to believe that it is true.
What did you make of April Fool's Day, that book, when you read the first draft?
Look, it's a very contradictory feelings. It's like you're reading the most wonderful piece of literature, and it's about your life, because I was part of it, and then reading things that just weren't true in it. So you have this, oh, wait a sec, he's done a brilliant, and so it's still my favourite book, whatever. And I think it's the best thing he's ever done. But at the time, there's a sense of exasperation that he's drawing characters or people we knew, and he made them into characters that just wasn't the way they were. But it made the story great, and that was the beginning of where I started to have a few problems.
You went back to your life in London after Damon's death. How did some cousins from South Africa coming to stay with you start to really undo the understanding that you had of your father's childhood in South Africa?
Yes, one of my cousins, Dory, she kind of quizzed me as to what did you know about our parents. I said, well, Dad's father died in a car accident. I think he was a lawyer sometimes Bryce said a judge, sometimes he said a lawyer, so I wasn't quite sure, but I think he was a lawyer. And she says, looked at me with this quizzical smile. And looking, okay, she said, okay. Then she went away for a few days. I believe, I can't prove this, that she talked to her mother. And they said, you better tell him. And so she came to me again and said, well, I think you better know the truth about the family. And she said, well, Bryce and my mother were born illegitimately to a clothing salesman who was an alcoholic of some sort. And your real name is Greer. Courtenay is just a made-up name. There were people in our family tree called Courtenay, different spelling actually. So his mother had taken one of the family names and just grafted it onto hers and become a Courtenay. And so when Bryce and his sister Rosemary were born, they became Courtenays.
But when your cousin said, okay, your grandfather wasn't some great crusading lawyer or judge, he was an alcoholic travelling salesman and you fathered your father illegitimately, did you believe her straight away?
Not for the very first second. I said, hey, what are you talking about? And then she started talking about times, dates, places, and I went, And then I thought to myself, Bryce has done a number on me again. He's woven his fantasy and all that sort of stuff.
How did you feel?
I felt very upset. Not because I didn't give a two hoots about whether he was legitimate or not. That doesn't worry me in the slightest. I felt like a fool. By this time I'm 30 years old. And, why shouldn't I believe? But I'm meant to be a journalist. I'm meant to ask better questions, but then you just believe what your parents tell you. And I felt like a fool. And then I thought, at some point I'm going to have to say something to him about this. And I did.
And what happened when you did?
Look, he was terrible denial. I had got to something, the nub of something. I said, Dad, why don't you just tell me? I don't care that you were legitimate or illegitimate. I just want you to tell me. I'm 30 years old, for God's sake. You should have sat me down when I was 16, 17, 18 and just said, look, here's the truth, son. But no, you didn't do that. Why? He said, I didn't know until this year. I went, what? You didn't know. I mean, all that stuff about Robin Hood to Courtenay or whatever it was. That was all fed to you. Yeah, yes, that was fed to me as well. I didn't know. I thought I was from a famous background. And I'm going, what? Come on, Dad, please. And then he started saying, are you saying I'm a liar? Are you trying to contradict? I didn't know about this. How dare you? And then how dare you ask me that question? So suddenly I felt guilty. So it's a classic case of gaslighting. Yeah.
So what did you learn from Bryce's older sister, Rosemary, about what their early life was really like? I mean, after their mum, Patty, had these two children and no husband, where did she go? How did she look after them?
Patty, look, there's a great word I learned this in writing this book called peripatetic. That means someone who can constantly wandering. And that's what she became. She became this wandering lady who... she wasn't accepted in her hometown, a little town in the north of Johannesburg called Barberton, because she was that wanton woman who had two children out of wedlock in the early 30s. You can imagine. In the early 30s, a woman like that is almost akin to being a witch. That's how they treated her, as some kind of vile human being. So she kept wandering and taking her children with her. And Bryce's life for the first, 8-10 years, it's almost like she was escaping. As soon as that new town they stayed at realised that this woman was a wanton woman, she had to move on.
Did she have any more contact with Bryce's biological father?
Yes. There were times when they went to stay with him. He had a wife and 6 children. So he had Bryce and Rosemary while he had these 6 children. And they would stay, and it was called an uncle or something like that, or, he was just known to be a friend. So at times when she was absolutely forlorn and didn't know where to go, she'd go to them. And apparently his wife, I think her name was Ivy, knew all the situation, and accepted Patty 100%, probably knowing what her husband was like.
Patty, at one point, while Bryce and Rosemary were still kids, married a man called Fred Roberts. What happened out of that marriage?
I don't know a great deal. I'm only going on what Rosemary said, but I think it was very short-lived. And yet again, she seemed to have married an alcoholic. And at some point, she fled him. He was torturing her or beating her, and the story goes, and I believe it because Rosemary says it, that they just escaped one time and had to live a couple of nights on the street, the three of them, mother and the two kids, and then she probably, I don't know, went to boarding houses, and Bryce was in boys' homes, and this is where I get the earlier sense that he was alone, totally alone.
It's a childhood of such hardship and trauma that he grew up around. So when your Aunt Rosemary remembered Bryce as a young kid, what kind of character was he? How did she remember his qualities?
She remembered him as the sort of person that, you know, we've seen him outgoing.
Despite all that?
Oh, despite everything. Bryce must have compensated for his loneliness by being incredibly gregarious, incredibly gifted at most things that he did. Fun. Apparently, whenever he was in a new town, would make friends quickly, but then they'd leave, so he'd lose those friends. Good at school, smart, intelligent. The girls loved him, apparently. That one came true to life.
According to Rosemary, Adam, when was she and Bryce told the true story of their origins? That this man, Arthur, was not actually an uncle, but their father? At
some point, his mother told them, I think they were both roughly, she might have been 14, he was 12.
So when they were still kids?
Yeah, when they were young kids. So I found that out later when reading Rosemary's, that it wasn't, he didn't find it out 6 months before or something. He knew when he was 13 that who his dad was.
Did you ever confront him, Adam, about all this stuff that he told you that wasn't true? Did that conversation ever happen?
We never had that conversation. Which is a great sadness to me. I would have loved to see him to sit me down or me to sit him down and say, look, Dad, it's just not true what you say, or this just didn't happen. Why did you say this, and this? We never had that conversation. And the best question I've been asked is, what would he think of what you've done now? He probably think, I don't really know. He might have thought, oh, good, well-written book, kiddo. But the other side of me says he would have hated this book. This book would have said everything that he didn't want people to know about him. And not because I'm doing it for that reason, because I'm just trying to set the record straight. He wouldn't have liked this book. And that's why we have no autobiography of Bryce, because he didn't want to do that. He didn't want to tell you what actually happened.
So after Bryce became this wildly successful author, he was continuing to reinvent himself. What did Bryce ring to tell you about a month before you were arriving back in Australia for a visit at the end of 1998?
Well, he told me that he'd met the love of his life. This person was the most amazing person he ever met, far better than my mother, and that he was leaving my mother for her. So I would know, I was privy to the fact that he was leaving my mother. I would be returning home in a few weeks, knowing that my parents were about to split, but my mother didn't know. So this was kind of the thing so I arrived at home with this knowledge that something big was about to happen. I felt that it wasn't for me to make this true, to let my mother know. But then I've been saying that all my life to people I knew that he'd been with, other women that he'd been with. So I've always felt a bit guilty about it. I didn't tell my mother the truth. As it happened, he didn't tell her himself. Somebody else told her, and then he fell into line, and it was more than a schmozzle. It was a pretty awful time.
Bryce went on to have a series of subsequent partners, and with one he built a big house in the country. What was his library there like?
His library, yeah. It was full of every edition of Bryce Courtenay books. Now, and we're talking about a library maybe 30 metres long, only had Bryce Courtenay books in it. And his reasoning was, all my friends would come over, I can make sure they get a book. But I didn't see any other books from any other author. There was 15 of the original Power of One, Tandia, all those books, and every time a new one comes, so it was very colourful. I have to say, his library was extremely colourful. All that, because Bryce Courtenay's books were full of colour, even on the outside.
Well, he got into this rhythm after the huge success of The Power of One of writing books almost every year, which sold hundreds of thousands of copies. What was it like, Adam, watching him interact with the public out in the world?
I watched it from The Power of One onwards, obviously, because that's the first one, and it seemed to morph, especially after April Fool's Day. People looked to him for guidance. People saw him as not just the greatest writer around, but as a guru. And Bryce picked up on that, obviously, and he loved it because he absolutely loved strangers coming. Are you Bryce Courtenay? Oh, let me tell you my story. And people would come up to him, and several times I saw this happen. Oh, you're Bryce, and start falling straight into tears as soon as they saw him because they'd read April Fool's Day. And because, as I said, that power he had to make them feel it's their story. So the story of Damon was their story, their tragedy. That's where this brilliance was. He'd make his tragedy into their tragedy. So they didn't see any difference. So people would come up, often women, and start crying. He said, it's okay. And he'd start talking to them. And he'd talk to them like almost like a priest would talk to if you had troubles. And he would minister to them. And within 20 minutes, he had them happy. They'd probably have a new book in their hand, signed. And he would say, off you go. You're all right. Everything's fine. I mean, he was just a master storyteller, but he was also a master listener. And what he did, the way he talked, he would tell you a story. Now, if someone came up to him and said, I want to tell you about my husband died of cancer and it was terrible. He said, let me tell you what I did. This is what happened to me. And then he'd take them away from their actual pain, take him to his story of power and strength and get them thinking that way as opposed to thinking about the reality of the pain. And he'd tell a story that was sort of connected. So Bryce didn't talk in to and fro and let's argue a position. He'd tell you, Sarah Kanowski, a story about himself. This is what I did. We wouldn't be having this kind of discussion with him. He'd be telling you a story that would kind of be related, but not exactly.
He was giving something to them, but he was also getting something back. He was getting a kind of attention and adulation that he was hungry for.
He absolutely loved, I call it the love of stranger love, I called it in the book. The way I describe it is a sort of ersatz version of love itself. It's a fake version of love because I don't think he had it as a kid. He was ignored and he needed it desperately. And it's related to what I talked to you about earlier about the feedback. He needed people to love what he did and love. So people coming to him was something he wanted. It wasn't, oh no, here they come again. It was, whoa, this is here's a new convert. I'll take that. They'll become a Bryce Courtenay convert here.
How were things between the two of you by the time he was dying of cancer in 2012?
Look, it had morphed from one thing to another. I think it wasn't terrible. There was no great schism. It wasn't terrible. I didn't trust him anymore. It's really where I was at by the time he was I couldn't believe in him anymore. I wasn't drinking the Kool-Aid. Yeah, there was a kind of coolness.
You didn't trust him anymore?
I didn't trust him. I didn't believe in him anymore. The thing that I just liked was every new partner that he had was brilliant and perfect and wonderful. So at what point did that person not become... And he was trying to run this over me, and I'm just going, please, no more. I'm just not going to listen, and please don't compare any of these people to my mother. That I will not deal with, because I love my mother desperately, and she was plenty flawed, like all of us, but I'm not going to suffer any comparisons.
Had Bryce left instructions about the kind of funeral that he wanted?
He did on his deathbed. He said, I want it to be fun. He said, I want everyone to have a nice time. It'll be a Bryce Courtenay occasion. And he brought loads of carts of fruit were there. And so the whole fruitologist thing came back in a big way. And he's also very big on sunflowers. So everybody who walked in got a plastic sunflower
and a piece of fruit.
And well, no, they didn't actually get fruit. The fruit was just sitting in a sort of cart, and I don't know what that was about. But that was Bryce's. He went out with fruit. He wanted to make sure there's plenty of fruit around. Whether people actually picked it and had some, I don't know.
It's clear to listen to you talk, Adam, and I think a term you use in the book is moral confusion, which is something your dad evoked in you really from your childhood. Has that clarified at all since putting this down and thinking through it and talking to other people? I mean, how has it got less confusing?
Yes. I had to wait 10 or 12 years to do this, and I wanted to be a writer in my own right, not the son of somebody who wrote a book about his dad. So a little bit like his Power of One, he had it working around in his brain. I had this one in my brain for 10 years. I always wanted to do this story because I think I was so tired of people telling me who Bryce Courtenay was, and I wanted to take the narrative back, if you like. So I'm thinking about this book over and over, and there was a lot of anger towards the end. And I said to myself, if there's anger, this will be wrong. Wait for the anger to subside so that you can see the full landscape. And about 2 years ago, I said, I think the anger's gone. It took me 10 years to get rid of any anger. And it wasn't huge anger. It was just emotional turmoil of feelings about things. I think I'm ready to do this now. And it was actually very, very easy to write because I'd already written it in my head. You asked me the question. Writing improves your clarity of things because you have to impart that to the reader. And if you have to impart, you have to really think about how you're putting that. Writing is a brilliant way of clarifying your ideas. So the writing of the book clarified what I thought, but the most important thing, what did I get? And when I started to realise this, the connection between his early life and his later ministering became much more clearer to me. And I started to feel not anger or frustration, compassion. I realised how amazing this man was. He'd come from nowhere. He'd had this terrible lifestyle, this hugely religious mother who had a very strong hold on him. And that's the real power of one, how he conquered from there to becoming what he was. But there's also compassion and great admiration that he got over all those things, the loneliness, the poverty, and became who we know today, one of the among the greatest writers this country's ever produced. And I still believe that. And so I feel great compassion and love. I still, a little bit of confusion, but it's better than it was, a lot better.
Adam Courtenay, thank you so much for sharing your story and Bryce's on Conversations.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much, Sarah.
Podcast. Broadcast and online. You're listening to Conversations with Sarah Kanowski.
Adam Courtenay was my guest on Conversations, and his memoir is called My Father Bryce. Adam's previous books include The Amazon Men and The Ship That Never Was. This conversation was recorded on the lands of the Turrbal and Yagara peoples. I'm Sarah Kanowski. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations with Sarah Kanowski. For more Conversations interviews, head to the website abc.net.au/conversations.